My name is Dr. Evelyn Reed, though for the better part of a decade, no one called me that. To my family, I was Evie, a name that sounded like hope. To my mentor, I was Reed, a name that sounded like a tool. And to myself, in the long, dark years that followed, I was nobody at all. At 35, I stood at the precipice of a discovery that could change the world, a breakthrough I had sacrificed my entire life to achieve. I was a geneticist, a rising star who had willingly dimmed her own light to focus on a single, desperate cause: my sister. I never imagined that the moment of my greatest triumph would also be the moment of my most profound betrayal. I never imagined that the family I had dedicated my life to saving would be the ones to calmly and quietly lock the door behind me when I was cast out into the cold. This is not a story about the glamour of science. It's a story about its human cost, about the lies we tell ourselves in the name of love, and about the grueling, painful, and ultimately beautiful process of finding your own worth when everything you valued has been stripped away. Science for me was never an abstract concept. It was the language I used to try and understand a world that often felt chaotic and cruel. It was a world of order, of rules, of cause and effect. It was a comfort. I grew up in a quiet suburb of Chicago, a place of manicured lawns and unspoken anxieties. My life was defined by two opposing forces: the boundless, vibrant chaos of my younger sister Anna, and the quiet, creeping dread of the disease that was slowly stealing her from us. Anna was my opposite in every way. Where I was quiet and methodical, she was a supernova of laughter, art, and impulsive joy. She painted murals on her bedroom walls, adopted stray animals, and could talk her way into and out of any situation with a dazzling smile. She was the heart of our small family, the sun around which my parents and I orbited. And then, when she was 16, the sun began to dim. It started subtly, a slight tremor in her hand that made her paintbrush slip. Moments of confusion where she would lose her train of thought mid-sentence, a brief, terrifying fog descending over her brilliant mind. Our family doctor dismissed it as stress, then adolescent anxiety. But I, already a graduate student in genetics at the University of Chicago, saw something more sinister in the patterns. I saw the ghost of a faulty protein, a miswritten line of code in her very being. The diagnosis, when it finally came a year later, had a long, complicated name: neuromyelin degenerative disorder, or NMDD. It was a rare, cruel genetic lottery ticket, a progressive disease that attacked the nervous system, slowly eroding muscle control, memory, and cognitive function. There was no treatment. There was no cure. The prognosis was a slow, agonizing fade over the course of a decade or two. The news shattered our family, leaving behind a fine, invisible dust of grief that settled on everything. My father, a stoic accountant, retreated further into the silent world of his ledgers. My mother, a high school English teacher, began a frantic, desperate search for miracles, dragging Anna to faith healers, alternative medicine gurus, and anyone who offered a sliver of hope, no matter how flimsy. I, on the other hand, turned to the only thing I trusted: data. I read every paper, every clinical trial, every obscure piece of research ever published on NMDD and related diseases. And in the digital stacks of countless scientific journals, one name appeared again and again: Dr. Alistair Finch. Dr. Finch was a titan in the world of genetics, a charismatic, silver-haired genius at a state university on the other side of town. He was a Nobel laureate whose early work had laid the foundation for much of modern gene therapy. By some miracle of fate or cosmic alignment, his lab was the only one in the world with a dedicated, albeit small, research program focused specifically on NMDD. He was our only real hope. I was 25 at the time, on the fast track. I had just been offered a prestigious, fully funded postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford, a golden ticket to a glittering career in academia. It was everything I had ever worked for. But one look at Anna, struggling to button her own coat, her face a mask of frustration as her fingers refused to obey, made the choice for me. I turned down Stanford. I took a position as a junior researcher in Dr. Finch's lab, a job that was, by every academic metric, a significant step down. The pay was lower, the prestige was non-existent, and the resources were a fraction of what I would have had in California. My colleagues in graduate school thought I was insane. "You're throwing your career away, Evie," my best friend had warned me. But when I went home and told my family, their reaction solidified my resolve. My mother wept with relief, clutching my hands as if I were a holy relic. "You'll save her, Evie," she whispered, a desperate prayer. "I know you will." My father, his face etched with a silent, profound gratitude, simply nodded. And Anna, my vibrant, beautiful sister, looked at me with a mixture of hope and a guilt so heavy it was a physical presence in the room. I had just chained my future to her illness, and we both knew it. "I'll find it, Anna," I promised her in the quiet of her room that night. The promise, a solemn vow. "I'll find the key." And so my new life began. Dr. Finch's lab was not the gleaming, state-of-the-art facility I had dreamed of. It was a cramped, cluttered space in the basement of an old university building, smelling perpetually of stale coffee, ozone from the centrifuges, and the faint, chemical tang of reagents. But to me it was a cathedral. Alistair Finch himself was everything his reputation suggested. Brilliant, charming, and possessed of a formidable intellect. He moved through the lab with an easy authority, a god in a white coat, and I hung on his every word. The key to NMDD, Reed, he told me in our first meeting, his intense blue eyes fixing on mine, is a single, misfolded protein. A biological typo. The cell's proofreader is asleep at the wheel. Our job is to find that typo and write a new sentence. For the next 10 years, that lab became my entire world. My life shrank to the dimensions of that basement room. I was the first to arrive, often before the sun came up, and the last to leave, long after the rest of the campus had gone dark. My apartment was just a place to sleep for a few hours, before returning to the real center of my existence. Friendships withered from neglect. Potential relationships never had a chance to bloom. I missed weddings, birthdays, holidays. My world was a landscape of petri dishes, gene sequencers, and endless meticulous data entry. The work was a slow, grinding process of elimination. We tested thousands of compounds, ran tens of thousands of simulations. There were countless false starts, dead ends, and moments of crushing disappointment when a promising lead would dissolve into nothing. Through it all, the silent clock of Anna's disease was always ticking in the back of my mind. Every time I went home for a family dinner, I would see the subtle, heartbreaking progression. The slight slur in her speech, the increased reliance on a cane, the growing frustration in her eyes as her own body became a foreign and uncooperative country. Her decline fueled my determination. The lab's funding was always precarious, a constant battle for grants that were stretched thin across the entire university. When a critical piece of equipment failed, or a new line of expensive reagents was needed, I didn't hesitate. I began to pour my own money into the research. First, it was the small inheritance my grandparents had left me. Then, it was my own meager savings. I told myself it was an investment, in my own future, in the future of my family. I was buying time. I was buying hope. My parents saw my sacrifice as a given, a natural extension of my role as the responsible one. They called often, their conversations always circling back to the same two questions. Any news? And, do you need us to send you anything? The latter was a coded inquiry about the lab's financial state, a prompt for me to reassure them that I had it covered. They never asked about me, about my life, about the toll the relentless work and pressure were taking. I was not their daughter anymore. I was a function. I was the cure project. Dr. Finch became the closest thing I had to a confidant. He was a master of encouragement, always knowing the right thing to say, to pull me out of a spiral of despair after a failed experiment. Patience, Reed, he'd murmur, looking over my data. Genius is not a lightning strike. It is the patient erosion of a mountain of ignorance, one grain of sand at a time. I idolized him. I trusted him completely. He was not just my mentor, he was my partner in this sacred quest. He understood the stakes, the urgency, the promise I had made in a quiet room, all those years ago. Or so I believed. I was so focused on the science, on the promise of the cure, that I failed to see the ambition that burned behind his kind, brilliant eyes. I failed to understand that for him, this was not just about saving my sister. It was about securing his legacy, about the glittering allure of a second Nobel Prize. I was a tool, the most dedicated and efficient tool he had ever had. And a tool, no matter how valuable, can always be discarded. The years in the lab bled into one another, a long, monotonous river of work, punctuated by small, frustrating eddies of failure. My life outside the basement ceased to exist. My world was a sterile, climate-controlled environment, a landscape of humming freezers and the soft, rhythmic click of pipettes. I tracked time not by seasons, but by the progress of cell cultures and the decay of radioactive isotopes. My social interactions were limited to brief, utilitarian exchanges with other researchers, and the increasingly strained phone calls with my family, which had devolved into a painful, repetitive script. "How are you, Evie?" my mother would ask, her voice tight with a forced cheerfulness that failed to mask her underlying desperation. "I'm fine, Mom. Working hard." "Any progress?" The word always hung in the air between us, heavy with the weight of all their hopes. "We're getting closer," I'd lie, or at least, I'd stretch the truth. The truth was, we were adrift in a vast ocean of genetic data, and I was beginning to fear we would never find land. Anna rarely came to the phone anymore. The disease was tightening its grip. The fog in her mind was becoming denser, her moments of lucidity shorter. My mother would relay stories of her struggles, a fall, a forgotten appointment, a terrifying episode of confusion in a familiar place. Each story was a fresh spur, driving me back to the lab with a renewed, frantic urgency. I started sleeping on a cot in my small office, unwilling to waste precious hours commuting. I subsisted on vending machine coffee and the stale granola bars I kept in my desk drawer. My world had shrunk to the size of a microscope slide. Dr. Finch, however, seemed to thrive on the slow, grinding nature of the work. He was a master of the long game. While I was in the trenches, running the day-to-day experiments, he was flying to conferences, schmoozing with grant committees, and maintaining his reputation as the elder statesman of genetics. He would sweep into the lab once or twice a week, his presence a whirlwind of energy and authority. He'd look over my data, offer a few words of cryptic encouragement or a challenging new hypothesis, and then disappear again, leaving me to execute his vision. "We're looking for a shadow, Reed," he told me during one of these visits, staring intently at a complex protein model on my computer screen. "A ghost in the machine. Everyone else is looking for the obvious culprit. We must look for its absence, for the one piece that isn't there when it should be." His words, as they often did, sparked a new line of inquiry. I began to re-examine years of old data, looking not for what was present, but for what was missing. It was a painstaking, mind-numbing process, cross-referencing thousands of genetic sequences, looking for a consistent, subtle anomaly. For 6 months I found nothing. I was chasing a ghost, just as he'd said, and I was losing faith that it even existed. The breakthrough, when it came, did not arrive like a lightning strike. It was a quiet, unassuming whisper in the dead of night. It was 3 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday in April. The lab was silent, except for the low, constant hum of the ventilation system. I was bleary-eyed, on my 4th cup of coffee, running what I had promised myself would be the final sequencing analysis for the night. I was staring blankly at the screen, watching the lines of code scroll past, when something caught my eye. It was a tiny, insignificant-looking gap in a single strand of RNA. A single, missing base pair. A biological typo, just as Finch had predicted. On its own, it meant nothing. But when I cross-referenced it with the data from every other NMDD sample we had, the pattern emerged. It was there, in every single one. It was the shadow, the ghost in the machine. The absence of this single piece of code was causing the critical protein to misfold, creating the toxic chain reaction that was NMDD. I felt a strange, cold, calm settle over me. My heart, which should have been hammering in my chest, was beating in a slow, steady rhythm. I ran the analysis again, and again. The result was the same every time. It was real. After 10 years of searching, of sacrificing, of relentless soul-crushing work, I had found it. I had found the key. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the screen, the glowing green characters reflecting in my glasses. A single tear traced a path through the grime on my cheek. It wasn't a tear of joy, not yet. It was a tear of profound, bone-deep relief. The mountain of ignorance had finally yielded. My first thought was of Anna. I had to tell her. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock it. I looked at the time. It was too early. I couldn't call home yet. My second thought was of Finch. I had to tell him. He was the only other person on the planet who could truly understand the magnitude of this moment. I sent him a single, concise email with the subject line, "I found it." I attached the core data file and a brief, technical explanation of my findings. Then, I sat back in my worn-out office chair and waited for the sun to rise. Finch arrived at the lab just after dawn. He looked as if he hadn't slept, his eyes bright with a feverish intensity. He didn't say hello. He walked straight to my computer, pushed me gently aside, and began to analyze the data himself, his long, elegant fingers flying across the keyboard. He worked in silence for nearly an hour, his brow furrowed in concentration. I stood behind him, holding my breath, my exhaustion completely forgotten, replaced by a thrumming, nervous energy. Finally, he leaned back in the chair and let out a long, slow breath. He turned to look at me, and his face was alight with a triumphant, almost predatory glee. "You did it, Reed," he said, his voice a low, reverent whisper. "My God, you actually did it." He stood up, and, to my complete surprise, he hugged me, a brief, hard embrace. "This changes everything," he said, his hands gripping my shoulders. Everything. That morning was the happiest of my life. The relief was intoxicating, a giddy, light-headed feeling. After Finch left to start making the necessary calls, I finally allowed myself to call home. My mother answered on the first ring, her voice already tight with anxiety. "It's me," I said, a wide, foolish grin spreading across my face. "Mom, I have news." I told her everything. I explained it in the simplest terms I could, the science of it all dissolving into the pure, simple magic of the outcome. "I found it, Mom," I said, the words catching in my throat. "I found the cause. We can fix it. We can actually fix it." The sound on the other end of the line was a raw, cathartic sob of pure, unadulterated joy. My father got on the phone, his voice thick with an emotion I had never heard from him before. And then, he passed the phone to Anna. "Evie?" Her voice was a faint, slurred whisper, but it was her. "It's me, Anna," I said, tears streaming freely down my face now. "I found it. I kept my promise." There was a long pause, and then I heard a sound that I hadn't heard in years, a sound I thought was lost forever. It was the sound of my sister, laughing. A real, clear, beautiful laugh. It was the sound of hope. In that moment, everything felt worth it. The 10 years of sacrifice, the missed holidays, the loneliness, the exhaustion. All of it was a small price to pay for that one beautiful sound. I had done it. I had saved my sister. I had earned my place. I was a hero. I was so blinded by the brilliant, shining light of my success that I didn't see the long, dark shadow it was casting, a shadow that was about to swallow me whole. The weeks following the breakthrough were a blur of heady, disorienting activity. The lab, once a quiet, monastic space, was suddenly buzzing with a new energy. Finch, re-energized by the discovery, was a constant presence, a whirlwind of motion and grand pronouncements. He brought in new equipment, hired 2 junior postdocs to help with the next phase, and held endless closed-door meetings with university administrators and pharmaceutical company representatives. I was, for a time, at the center of this new universe. Finch was effusive in his praise, constantly referring to my brilliant, tenacious work in meetings. He had me walk the new researchers through my data, my methodologies, my thought processes. I spent hundreds of hours documenting every step of my decade-long journey, creating a meticulous, comprehensive record of the research. It was exhausting, but exhilarating. I felt like a true partner in the discovery, a key player on a team that was about to change the history of medicine. But then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, things began to shift. The invitations to the high-level meetings became less frequent. When I would ask Finch about the progress with a potential pharmaceutical partner, his answers became vague and dismissive. "It's all administrative nonsense, Reed," he'd say, waving a hand. "Boring legal stuff. You should focus on the real science, on the next steps." He began to take a more direct, hands-on role with the data, a task he had always delegated to me in the past. He insisted on personally compiling all of my notes and research into the final manuscript for publication. "It's a delicate process, writing for a journal like Nature," he explained, his tone smooth and reasonable. "There's a certain narrative structure they expect. As the senior author, it's my responsibility to shape it correctly." A small, cold knot of unease began to form in my stomach. I tried to dismiss it as imposter syndrome, the paranoia of a junior researcher suddenly thrust onto the world stage. I was just tired. I had been running on adrenaline for weeks. Finch was my mentor, my partner. I trusted him. The unease grew, however, when I asked to see a draft of the paper. "It's not ready for fresh eyes yet, Evie," he said, using my first name, a casual intimacy he employed whenever he wanted to disarm me. "You're too close to it. I need you to focus on the validation trials. That's the most critical work right now." So I buried myself in the validation trials, a series of repetitive, but necessary, experiments to confirm my initial findings. It was rote work, but I threw myself into it, grateful for the distraction from the nagging voice in the back of my head. My family, in their own blissful bubble of hope, was oblivious to the subtle shift in the lab's dynamics. They were busy planning for Anna's future, a future that now seemed bright and limitless. They talked about her going back to art school, about traveling, about a life free from the creeping fog of her disease. My role in their conversations had shifted from savior in progress to confirmed hero. They didn't need to worry about me anymore. I had fulfilled my purpose. I discovered the betrayal on a Wednesday morning. I came into the lab early, as always, and was scrolling through a science news aggregator while I waited for a centrifuge to finish its cycle. And there it was, a headline that made the air rush out of my lungs. "Finch Lab announces landmark discovery in NMDD research, paving way for cure." My hands went cold. My heart started a frantic, panicked drumming against my ribs. Finch hadn't told me he was releasing the news. With a trembling finger, I clicked the link. It took me to the online pre-publication section of Nature. The full title of the paper was there, a long, technical string of words, and underneath it, the list of authors. Alistair Finch, PhD. And that was it. One name. I stared at the screen, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. It had to be a mistake. A typo. A placeholder. They must have forgotten my name. I frantically searched the full article, scrolling down to the acknowledgments section, the place where labs thank their technicians and junior staff. My name wasn't there either. It wasn't just an omission of credit. It was a complete and total erasure. 10 years of my life, my sacrifice, my intellectual labor, my singular, world-changing breakthrough, it had all been reduced to an empty, gaping void. I simply did not exist. The room began to spin. A high-pitched ringing started in my ears. I felt a wave of nausea so intense I had to grip the edge of my desk to keep from falling. I was, in that moment, a ghost in my own life. I don't remember walking to Finch's office. I only remember standing in front of his desk, the printed-out article clutched in my hand, the paper shaking so violently, it made a soft, rustling sound in the silent room. He was on the phone, but he hung up when he saw the look on my face. He didn't look surprised. He looked prepared. "What is this?" I asked, my voice. He glanced down at it, then back up at me, his expression a carefully crafted mask of paternal concern. Ah, yes. It went live this morning. A bit sooner than I expected. Exciting, isn't it? My name, I said, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. Where is my name? He sighed, a long, theatrical sigh of feigned disappointment. He leaned back in his leather chair and steepled his fingers. Read, he began, his voice dropping into the calm, reasonable tone of a man explaining a simple concept to a child. We've discussed this. Publication in a journal of this caliber is a complex matter. The senior author, the one who provides the intellectual framework, the funding, the vision, that is the name that carries the weight. The intellectual framework? I was sputtering, my shock giving way to a tidal wave of white-hot rage. Alistair, I found it. The data, the analysis, the discovery. It was all mine. You know it was. Your contribution was invaluable, he said smoothly, the words utterly meaningless. You were an excellent pair of hands in the lab. Truly one of the best technicians I've ever had. But a discovery of this magnitude is the culmination of a lifetime of work. My lifetime of work. You were executing my vision, following the path I laid out. He was gaslighting me, rewriting history, right in front of my eyes. He was taking my decade of intellectual and physical labor and reducing it to the work of a mere assistant. I will not let you do this, I said, my voice gaining strength from the sheer force of my fury. I have my lab notes. I have the original data files, the timestamps. I have proof. I will go to the university. I will go to the journal. I will expose you. For the first time, a flicker of something cold and hard entered his eyes. The mask of the benevolent mentor fell away, and I saw the ruthless, ambitious man beneath. And who do you think they will believe, Reed? He asked softly, the quietness of his voice more threatening than any shout. A disgruntled junior researcher, or a Nobel laureate with a 30-year reputation? You will find that my vision is meticulously documented. You will find that your lab notes are, according to university policy, the property of this lab, my lab. If you try to make this a fight, you will not only lose, you will be committing career suicide. I will personally see to it that you never work in a reputable lab in this country again. I stood there, defeated, the full, diabolical scope of his betrayal crashing down on me. He had planned this. He had used me, taken everything from me, and then built an impenetrable fortress of lies around my own work to keep me out. But I had one last hope, my family. They knew the truth. They knew the years of sacrifice, the endless hours, the promise I had made. They would be my witnesses. They would fight for me. I fled the lab, stumbling through the hallways in a blind daze. I drove home, though I have no memory of the journey. I burst through my parents' front door, my face stained with tears, the offending article still clutched in my hand. They were in the living room with Anna, looking at brochures for art schools in warmer climates. They looked up, their happy, smiling faces, turning to expressions of alarm. Evie, what's wrong? My mother asked, rushing to my side. I couldn't form a coherent sentence. I just sobbed, holding out the paper. He stole it, I finally managed to choke out. Finch, he stole it all. He published it under his name. He erased me. I explained everything. The lies, the confrontation, the threats. I expected outrage. I expected them to leap to their feet, to call a lawyer, to rally to my defense. Instead, I was met with a deep, unsettling silence. My father stared at the floor, his face pale. Anna looked confused, her cognitive processing too slow to keep up with the sudden shift in the narrative. And my mother. My mother's face was a complex mask of fear and calculation. Evie, sweetheart, she began, her voice cautious, as if she were speaking to a wild animal. Are you sure you're not overreacting? Dr. Finch is a very important man. Maybe this is just how it works, at that high level. Overreacting. I stared at her, incredulous. Mom, he stole 10 years of my life. He stole our cure. But it's not stolen, is it? She said quickly, her eyes darting towards Anna. The cure is still coming. Dr. Finch himself called us this morning. He told us Anna would be one of the first to receive the new therapy, as a professional courtesy. He was so kind, so generous. And then I understood. He had gotten to them first. He had offered them the ultimate bribe, their daughter's life. You can't let him get away with this, I pleaded, turning to my father. Dad, this is wrong. You know it's wrong. He finally looked at me, his eyes full of a weary, defeated shame. What do you want us to do, Evelyn? He asked, his voice barely audible. Challenge him? Make a scene? What if he changes his mind? What if he takes Anna off the list? We can't risk that. We can't. They were choosing the cure over the truth. They were choosing the cure over me. The very reason for my decade of sacrifice, my love for my sister, my duty to my family, was now being used as the weapon to ensure my silence and my erasure. Please, Evie, my mother begged, her voice dropping to a whisper. Don't rock the boat. Don't ruin this for Anna. After all you've done, Don't mess it up now. Just let it go. Let it go. She was asking me to let go of my life's work, my integrity, my entire professional identity. I looked at my sister, who was watching the exchange with a dawning, horrified understanding in her eyes. I looked at my parents, their faces pleading with me to accept the unjust peace they had made. And in that moment, I felt a profound, bottomless sense of loneliness. I had been cast out. I had sacrificed everything for them, and in the final accounting, I was deemed expendable. My promise was fulfilled, but the person who had made it no longer mattered. The days that followed the betrayal were a descent into a gray, featureless landscape of despair. Finch was true to his word. Within a week, I was formally dismissed from my position at the university. The official reason was a vague restructuring of the research department. The unofficial reason spread through the tight-knit academic community like a virus. I was unstable, a disgruntled researcher who had tried to claim credit for her mentor's genius. My name was Mud. My phone calls to colleagues went unreturned. My emails to other labs inquiring about positions were met with a deafening silence. I had been effectively and efficiently blacklisted. My family, in a collective act of self-preservation, completed my exile. Our phone calls became short, stilted affairs, thick with unspoken words. They would ask about my job search with a feigned, brittle concern, but what they were really asking was if I was keeping quiet. They would talk endlessly about Anna's upcoming treatment, about the miracle Dr. Finch was providing, their voices full of a gratitude that was a slap in the face to me. They never mentioned the paper, my name, or the 10 years of my life again. It was as if it had never happened. I had become a ghost in my own family, a non-person whose sacrifice was now an inconvenient and embarrassing truth. After 2 months of sleeping on a friend's couch, burning through my savings, and facing a future that was a terrifying blank wall, I knew I had to get out of Chicago. The city itself felt haunted. Every university building was a monument to the career I had lost. Every street corner held a memory of a life that no longer existed. I needed to go somewhere no one knew my name, somewhere the shadow of Alistair Finch couldn't reach. I packed my few belongings into my old Honda Civic and drove west, with no destination in mind. I drove for 3 days, fueled by cheap coffee and a sense of profound, untethered emptiness. I ended up in a small, forgotten town in the high plains of Colorado, a place called Prairie Ridge. It was the antithesis of my former life, quiet, unpretentious, and surrounded by a vast, silent expanse of sky and earth. I rented a small, cheap apartment above a hardware store, and began the humbling, soul-crushing process of looking for work. My PhD in genetics was now a liability, a relic from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. I was wildly overqualified for most jobs, and professionally toxic for any job in my actual field. I eventually found work at Prairie Ridge Community College, not as a professor, but as a lab technician and part-time adjunct instructor for introductory biology. The pay was abysmal. The lab was a relic from the 1980s, with ancient equipment and a chronic shortage of basic supplies. It was the academic equivalent of exile to Siberia. The first few months were a special kind of hell. I felt like a failure, a fraud. I would spend my days cleaning glassware and preparing solutions for other people's classes. The mindless, repetitive work, a constant, mocking reminder of the complex, groundbreaking research I had once led. The woman who had been on the verge of curing a major disease was now teaching bored teenagers how to properly focus a microscope. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. But then, slowly, something began to shift. It wasn't a sudden epiphany, but a gradual, quiet transformation. It began with the students. They weren't the ambitious, privileged prodigies I had known in the university world. They were working single mothers, trying to get a nursing degree. They were veterans on the GI Bill, trying to build a new life after their service. They were local farm kids, the first in their families to ever attend college, their eyes wide with a raw, unpolished curiosity. They didn't care about publications or prestige. They cared about the why. Why did a cell divide? Why did a flower turn towards the sun? They asked questions that were simple, profound, and utterly devoid of academic pretension. One student, a young woman named Maria, who worked the night shift at a local diner, became fascinated by the simple Mendelian genetics of pea plants we were studying. She stayed after class, her hands still smelling faintly of coffee and bleach, and asked question after question, her mind lit up by the simple, elegant logic of it all. In her, I saw a flicker of the same pure, unadulterated passion for science that had first inspired me as a girl. I started spending extra time with her and with other students like her, nurturing their curiosity, helping them design small, independent projects. We didn't have a gene sequencer, but we could track the migration patterns of local birds. We didn't have a mass spectrometer, but we could analyze the water quality of the local creek. I was rediscovering the soul of science. I was remembering that the real work isn't done for the sake of a Nobel Prize or a multi-billion-dollar patent. It's done for the simple, profound joy of understanding the world a little bit better. It's done for the spark that ignites in a student's eyes when a complex idea finally clicks into place. My work was no longer about chasing a cure, it was about planting seeds. During this time, I followed the news of my old life from a safe, painful distance. Dr. Finch, as predicted, became an international celebrity. He was on the cover of magazines, hailed as a humanitarian and a visionary. He formed a multi-billion-dollar biotech company, Finch Therapeutics, to market the NMDD therapy. And then, inevitably, he was awarded his second Nobel Prize in medicine. I watched his acceptance speech on a grainy live stream in the community college library, a hollow ache in my chest. He spoke eloquently about his lifetime of dedication and the lonely, patient work of discovery. He never mentioned my name. My sister, Anna, began the treatment. My mother would send me brief, sterile email updates. Anna had her first infusion today. The doctors are very optimistic. I felt a complex, gut-wrenching mixture of emotions. I was profoundly grateful that the science, my science, was working, that my sister was being given back her future. But that gratitude was hopelessly entangled with the deep, bitter pain of my own erasure, and the knowledge that my family was celebrating a victory that had been built on my invisible sacrifice. Years passed. I settled into my quiet life in Prairie Ridge. I was promoted to a full-time faculty position at the college. I bought a small, fixer-upper house at the edge of town. I adopted a stray dog. I made friends, real friends, who knew me not as a failed scientist, but as Professor Reed, the woman who could make biology interesting, the woman who always had time for a student in need. The gaping wound of my betrayal had not disappeared, but it had begun to scar over, the pain dulling from a constant, sharp agony to a familiar, manageable ache. I was not happy, not in the triumphant, celebratory way I had once defined the word, but I had found a measure of peace. I had built a new life, a smaller, quieter life, from the ashes of the old one. And then, one cold Tuesday afternoon, 7 years after I had been cast out, an email appeared in my inbox that would change everything, all over again. The subject line was simple: I'm sorry. It was from a Dr. Ben Carter, a name I vaguely recognized as one of the junior postdocs Finch had hired in the final weeks after my discovery. My hand trembled as I clicked it open. The email was long, rambling, and clearly written by a man whose conscience had been tormenting him for years. He wrote that he had known from the beginning that the discovery was mine. He confessed that Finch had ordered him to systematically relabel and redate all of my original data files, creating a false digital trail that pointed to Finch as the primary researcher. He had lived with the guilt of his complicity for 7 years. He was leaving academia, he wrote, and he could not leave with this lie still on his soul. Attached to the email was a password-protected zip file. The password was a single word: sorry. Inside the file was everything: my original, time-stamped data, scanned pages from my lab notebooks, and a series of incriminating emails from Finch, instructing him on how to cover their tracks. It was the proof, the undeniable, irrefutable truth. My ghost had finally come back to speak. For 2 full days after receiving Ben Carter's email, I did nothing. I stared at the zip file on my computer desktop, a small, digital bomb that had the power to detonate the carefully constructed piece of my new life. The old Evie, the ambitious, justice-seeking scientist, would have immediately forwarded the evidence to every scientific journal, every university ethics board, every major news outlet in the country. She would have craved vindication, demanded retribution. But I was not that person anymore. The thought of re-entering that world, of facing the media circus, the legal battles, the inevitable confrontation with Finch and my family, filled me with a profound sense of dread. What would be the point? To reclaim a name in a world I no longer wanted to be a part of? To win a war that had already cost me everything that mattered? On the 3rd day, I showed the email to the only person whose opinion I truly trusted. My friend and department head at the college, a pragmatic, no-nonsense woman named Sarah. She read it in silence, her expression growing more thunderous with each paragraph. "My God, Evie," she said when she finished, her voice a low growl. "This is monstrous. You have to do something. You can't let him get away with this." "But what will it change, really?" I asked, the question a genuine one. "The cure is out there. Anna is healthy. My life is here. Raking all of that up will just reopen wounds that have finally started to heal." "It's not about changing the past," Sarah said, her eyes fixed on mine. "It's about owning your truth. It's not just for you. It's for every student in your classroom who you teach about the importance of integrity. It's for every woman in science who has ever had her work dismissed or stolen by a powerful man. This is bigger than you, Evie." Her words struck a chord. I had spent 7 years teaching my students about the scientific method, about the relentless, unbiased pursuit of truth. How could I look them in the eye if I was unwilling to fight for my own? With Sarah's help, I hired a lawyer, a sharp, tenacious woman who specialized in intellectual property and academic fraud. We decided on a simple, direct strategy. We sent the complete file of evidence to two places simultaneously: the Ethics Board of the Nobel Committee and the Board of Directors of Finch Therapeutics. The fallout was swift and catastrophic. The Nobel Committee, faced with undeniable proof of fraud, launched an immediate, high-profile investigation. The Board of Finch Therapeutics, terrified of the legal and financial implications, panicked. Within a month, Alistair Finch was forced to resign in disgrace from the company he had built on a foundation of my work. The story exploded across the scientific community and then into the mainstream media. I was no longer a ghost. I was the headline. The Finch fraud. How a Nobel laureate stole a cure. My quiet life in Prairie Ridge was shattered. My house was surrounded by news vans. My phone rang incessantly, with calls from reporters, from publishers offering book deals, from universities offering me prestigious endowed chairs. It was a dizzying, overwhelming onslaught. It was everything I had once dreamed of. My name cleared, my work acknowledged, my reputation restored. But it felt hollow. The most difficult call came from my mother. She sobbed into the phone, a torrent of apologies, excuses, and self-serving justifications. "We never knew, Evie," she cried. "We were just so scared for Anna. We didn't understand. Can you ever forgive us?" "I don't know," I said honestly, a quiet emptiness where the anger and hurt used to be. "I need time." I knew that forgiveness, if it ever came, would be a long and complicated process. The trust that had been broken could not be easily mended. The most important call, however, came from Anna. Her voice was clear and strong, the voice I remembered from our childhood. There was no fog, no hesitation. "I read everything, Evie," she said, her voice thick with a shame that was not hers to bear. "I am so sorry. I was a coward. We all were. You sacrificed everything for me, and when it mattered most, I didn't stand up for you. There is no excuse for that." "The treatment is working?" I asked, the question still the most important one. "Yes," she said. "It's working. Thanks to you. And only you. I know that now." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. In the end, after the media storm had subsided and the dust had begun to settle, I was left with a choice. The University of Chicago, in a public act of atonement, offered me a fully funded, state-of-the-art lab of my own, a tenured professorship, and a salary that was more than I had ever dreamed of. It was the golden ticket, the glittering prize. The life I had thrown away a decade ago, now offered back to me on a silver platter. I flew back to Chicago to give them my answer in person. I walked through the familiar, hallowed halls of the university, a place that had once been the entire scope of my ambition. And I felt nothing, no sense of homecoming, no spark of desire. I sat across from the dean, the same man who had signed my dismissal letter 7 years earlier, and I politely declined his offer. "But why?" he stammered, genuinely baffled. "This is everything you ever wanted." It was, I acknowledged with a small smile. "But it's not anymore. I discovered something in my time away. I discovered that my purpose isn't to win prizes or publish papers. It's to teach. It's to mentor. It's to spark the same curiosity in a new generation that first inspired me. I can do that best, where I am." I returned to Prairie Ridge, to my small house, my loyal dog, and my underfunded lab at the community college. I used the substantial settlement I received from the university to create a foundation that provides scholarships for women and minorities from rural communities to pursue careers in science. My life is quiet. It is unassuming. It will never be featured on the cover of a magazine. But every morning, when I walk into my classroom and see the eager, hopeful faces of my students, I know that I am home. My name, Dr. Evelyn Reed, is not valuable because it is now cleared and vindicated in the eyes of the world. It is valuable because of the work I choose to do with it, because of the small, quiet seeds of discovery I get to plant every single day. The world may remember Alistair Finch as the man who stole a cure, but I have learned that my own legacy will not be defined by a single, stolen breakthrough. It will be defined by the hundreds of small, quiet moments of teaching, of connection, of nurturing the next generation of truth seekers. And that, I have come to understand, is a legacy that can never be stolen.